Welcome to episode 499. Some Southern Baptists say that if Vodi Bakum becomes the next president of the SBC, it will be a step toward racial reconciliation. When Phil disagreed in a tweet last weekend, it triggered a social media tsunami. He's here to respond to the controversy. And then we discussed Jamar Tisby's recent article about how the murder of Trayvon Martin 10 years ago ended white evangelicalism's efforts at racial reconciliation. But was the movement flawed from its very beginning? Then I have a wide-ranging conversation with author and conservative New York Times columnist David Brooks. We cover all kinds of issues, including how to save evangelicalism from politics and responses to the war in Ukraine. This is a very full episode, so let's get rolling. Here is Holy Post 499.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
And Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
And Jason Rugg. Hello, Jason.
Hey there.
How many miles?
None today.
Nothing?
No,
After?
I went and got a haircut instead.
That
Yeah,
is
I saw
not the
that.
same. That's not the same. Oh, I can't see that. You're in the dark.
Yeah.
You're in the dark.
I saw
Look.
it on Twitter because
Oh,
somebody made fun of me for
Yeah,
it.
someone tagged Sky because I got a haircut and Sky can't.
Oh.
It was very mean,
That's not nice.
Oh.
mean.
but it was
Man.
still funny. So
It's like tagging Caitlin because she can't be a pastor in the SBC. Oh, now it's time for the
Ouch.
theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
Okay, so Pat Robertson popped up last week.
Like the groundhog to
Yeah, Pat
tell us there's 6
Robertson-
more months of winter or whatever.
Pat Robertson popped up, and we will have 6 more weeks of bad eschatology. So he decided to inform us that Vladimir Putin is being driven by God to invade Ukraine so that we can bring about the end times. It didn't take very long. Actually, it kind of did. It took more than about a week. It took about a week for this to become part of the end times.
He's pretty old.
Well,
So
but
you're
I mean,
saying
no
he
one
was
else
processing it
jumped on it.
slowly?
Yeah.
No one else jumped on it sooner. I don't know.
Oh.
I haven't seen many others jump on the this is it, Gog and Magog, which is, that new brand of bourbon that's taking off for hipsters.
Do you think it's because Ukraine is just far enough away from the Middle East that it didn't quite hit the radar screens of most of the dispensational
Maybe,
folks?
Possibly,
Okay.
maybe. I don't know.
Sky, you're going to get in trouble
What?
with the dispensationalists.
Well,
Yeah,
I was
you
I
picking on
meant, like,
dispensationalists?
the dispensational eschatological prophecy people, which is a
Okay.
much narrower.
Yes. Be
It's
more
slice.
specific.
complex.
Yes.
Tell
Yeah,
us
okay.
exactly who you're talking about. Be specific.
Well, we've talked about this in the past, but when I was a kid, I remember going to the Christian bookstore and seeing those end time books that always had Mikhail Gorbachev on it.
Yeah.
And his
Yeah.
birthmark on his head is some kind of mark of the beast thing. And it's like everything from the 80s is back again. The Cold War is back. The threat of nuclear war is back. The whole Ruskies versus the NATO thing is back.
Yeah.
It's just weird.
Yeah, women wearing shoulder pads is back. Everything is back. Everything right is wrong again. ABBA just put out a new album. Everything.
It's like we're so decadent we can't even come up with new geopolitical foes anymore.
We can't come up with new decadence. We have to
Yeah.
return to our old decadence.
There's another new Batman movie out yet again.
I know. I'm
They
not
keep
even
getting
going to watch
grittier.
it. I'm not even going to watch it.
I
'cause
watched it.
I've seen Batman. I know how it ends. It's just,
Mm.
he's kind of depressed and he fights. Okay, next Batman movie.
But this time he has emo hair, so it's better.
It's new. I hated when they did that with Spider-Man. Why would I like it when they did that with Batman? Come on, people. Okay, I created a ruckus on Twitter over the weekend I made a ruckus. It was kind of accidental. Here's how it happened. Can I tell you about it? You guys want to hear
Mm-hmm.
about my ruckus? Okay. So every now and then I get, kind of just attacked out of nowhere by someone. And sometimes I ignore them. And sometimes, what? Caitlin? Is
Are
there
you
something
comparing
like to
yourself to Ukraine?
share with the class?
I couldn't tell if you were serious about being attacked out of nowhere or if that was
Sometimes.
really okay.
Well, it might be in response to a podcast episode, or it might be
Maybe.
in response
Yes.
to
Okay.
something else that someone else said that I commented on. I don't know. It's so hard to tell. And so a few weeks ago, I got somebody attacked me who was kind of a very conservative Southern Baptist pastor from Florida. And so I engaged and said, really, why do you think that? And we went back and forth. And as happens sometimes, Sky, let this be a lesson unto you. We became friends. And so now we follow each other on Twitter, and I instant message him sometimes. So he tweet, because the Southern Baptists are meeting about their next president and who's going to be nominated.
Didn't they just do this?
Yes.
Yeah, they do it every 2 months.
I feel like we just had this election.
Well,
This isn't the election. This isn't the big thing. This is, I don't know how this works.
and Ed Litton stepped down a year early.
How long is the term?
It's 2 years, and he only did one.
So they need nominees.
So it is
because then
very
they have to run their campaigns for a full year and travel around in buses to other SBC churches. So anyway, the rumor came out that Vodi Bakum might be a candidate for presidency of the SBC. And my friend tweeted and said, well, maybe, because he's African-American theologian, maybe that would kind of restart the racial reconciliation movement within the SBC. And here's what I should have done, because my wife is helping me learn lessons from things. What I should have done is just direct messaged my friend and said, here's what I think about that.
Wow.
Yeah. Instead, I tweeted back at him because I tweeted back at him and said, probably not. Here's why, and if you don't know who Vodi Bakum is, he's an anti-social justice warrior. He wrote the book Fault Lines about how social justice is ruining the church, and has very controversial views about Ferguson and the killing of Michael Brown, that Michael Brown brought it on himself by living a thuggish lifestyle. So he has some very controversial views that make he's quite popular in conservative white Christian circles and quite unpopular in most Christian black circles. So I said he might not be a good choice to lead a racial reconciliation movement. It'd kind of be like making Candace Owens the next president of the SBC. And I didn't think it would go much further than that. But people went crazy.
Weird.
They went crazy. And then some, better known conservative Southern Baptists retweeted my comments. And then people started calling me racist. And then they started calling me worse words than that. And I was the reason why America is so terrible, because of all these wokesters who say, and what they were saying was, you're saying that Vodi Bakum is the wrong kind of black person. So you're just like Joe Biden when he said, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. So that's what you're saying. You say you're the spokesperson for all black people when you say what. And it just went on. In fact, it's been 2 days and it's still going on, because Jenna Ellis got into it, who's a Fox Newsmax Trump personality with 700,000 followers. And she tweeted about me. And then a Baptist blog wrote up a story on it over the weekend that got circulated. And Owen Straken, whatever his name is, tweeted about me. And then now it's just gone crazy.
So everyone's piling on Phil, huh?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what did we learn?
It sounds like a sitcom title. Pile on Phil.
I keep your opinions to yourself. But how do things get better? How do things get better, Caitlin, if we have to keep our opinions to ourselves?
I don't know. I don't think you should keep your opinions to yourself, but
Depends on the opinion.
it
Would make
depends. Well,
it hard
yes,
to
it
podcast.
definitely depends on the opinion.
So, did Vodi Bakum ever wade into this?
No, he's not on Twitter, and he's in Africa. He runs a school, a seminary in Africa. Currently has for a couple of years.
Do you know he's a practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Yeah, he's a hulking man. He's a
You
large
might not want to criticize him.
large man. No, I wasn't criticizing him. I was pointing out the lack of overlap between his views on social issues and the views of most African American Christians, and thinking that may not be who they would choose to try to bring about reconciliation.
Right. So all you were saying is that this potential candidate, who some people are saying would be representative of Black Christians in the Southern Baptist Convention, you are simply pointing out that his views don't align with most Black leaders in the SBC.
Well, I don't know about, I haven't polled Black Christians within the SBC, but definitely in the broader culture. Yes, Black Christians overwhelmingly believe there is systemic racism in America. Vodi Bakum overwhelmingly says there is no systemic racism in America. So he's not terribly well aligned with the beliefs of most Black Christians. And that leads me to the story that I really wanted to talk about today, which kind of fits in with all of this, which is a piece that Jamar Tisby wrote. He wrote it the week before last. I wanted to talk about it last week, but I ran out of time. So I don't want to talk about this, but we're out of time, and I won't give it enough time. And now the fact that I ended up in a 2-day Twitter pile-on over the same topic, which is the topic of racial reconciliation within evangelicalism. So Jamar Tisby wrote a piece on February 26th entitled Trayvon Martin's Murder and the Death of the Evangelical Racial Reconciliation Movement. That reactions from white evangelicals to Trayvon Martin's murder foreshadowed the end of an interracial era. Okay, that seems like kind of a strong statement. It ended a whole era of racial reconciliation. So, and it's the 10th anniversary of the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. So I wanted to dive into this because it's fascinating. You might agree with Jamar, you might disagree with Jamar, but it's worth the conversation because I think I've seen this in my own experience of the last 2 years. So I think he's onto something. So here's where he starts. Beginning around the 1990s, white evangelicals began embracing something called racial reconciliation. They started reaching across the color line to form racially inclusive fellowships. For the next 2 decades, the number of multiracial churches, where at least 20% of the congregation is comprised of people of color, more than tripled. So we actually saw a movement start in the 1990s that greatly increased the number of interracial congregations.
Didn't a lot of this kind of get kicked off with Promise Keepers?
Promise Keepers was a big part of it. The SBC made a formal apology for slavery and had a ceremony where a white pastor washed a black pastor's feet. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of symbolism in it, a lot of symbolic, we're bearing the hatchet, assuming there were hatchets flying in 2 directions for the last however many hundred years. And we're going to get along now, and we're going to be friends. So Jamar's point is that the momentum of this thing actually shrouded the weakness of this movement. The movement was more committed to grand events than substantive partnerships, more concerned with visible diversity than changing mindsets, more invested in personal relationships than policy transformation, that the veneer of unity of the U.S. racial reconciliation movement cracked under the pressure of the murder of a black teenager named Trayvon Martin in 2012. So now, if you don't remember that one, that was the kid who was walking through a gated, I think it was a gated subdivision in a hoodie, and a self-appointed community watch guy chased him down, fought with him, and then shot him.
And he was unarmed except for some Skittles.
He was unarmed except for some Skittles. And the man who shot him, George Zimmerman, was found not guilty on the grounds of Florida's Stand Your Ground law. So, okay. So why, and Jamar goes through everything he did personally to try to help drive the racial reconciliation movement. He started 2 different organizations to help push it along. He, went to white seminaries and started working more and more in white evangelical spaces. So he says, we had momentum and enthusiastic support even from white Christians. It seemed like this racial reconciliation thing was about to reach even higher levels. Then they killed Trayvon Martin. The same night, on July 13th, 2013, a jury acquitted George Zimmerman of all charges. That same night was the night Alicia Garza, a black activist in Oakland, California, sat down at her computer and wrote a love note to black people. In the brief post, she wrote, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." And that was the post that started the Black Lives Matter movement. So the Black Lives Matter movement came directly out of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, which came directly out of a response to the shooting of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. Okay. That exposed a significant difference in point of view between white people in America and black people in America. 49% of whites thought the verdict acquitting Zimmerman was great. They approved of it. Only 5% of African Americans thought the acquittal was good, and that was the proper outcome. So it was a huge, and because, the 49% of whites that agreed with the outcome were on the more conservative side of the white audience, they were also on the more Christian side of the white audience. So what you had was a lot of African American Christians who disagreed with this outcome, felt it was unjust, sitting in white churches with people who completely saw it the opposite way.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Because I read this article a couple weeks ago and I don't remember all of it. But does he factor into this time frame the fact that Barack Obama was the president? Because I think having Barack Obama in the White House, although few people will openly admit this, I think was such a shock to the white system that it made sections of white America way, way, way more sensitive to the shifting demographic and cultural realities of the country, which meant the rise of Black Lives Matter and other things around it were reacted to with perhaps a sensitivity that may not have existed in an earlier era or in the 1990s or prior to Obama's election. In other words, I don't think you can divorce the reaction to George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin apart from the context of the first black president and a lot of the cultural and political just fury and chaos that was unleashed by that dramatic shift.
Yeah, he doesn't mention that. Jamar doesn't mention that. I haven't seen any data or surveys about that. I have one pretty good anecdote. The morning after the election of Barack Obama, I was standing 10 feet away from James Dobson at Focus on the Family headquarters while he was doing his radio show reacting to the election. And he said to him, it was like being hit in the back of the head with a hammer. The election of Barack Obama, and that America just wasn't going to look the same anymore. So that's one strong reaction from a very central figure to the religious right over the last 40 years. So Jamar goes on and says, at that point, when they realized how many of their white Christian brothers and sisters saw the issue of Trayvon Martin's murder so differently, he said, people like me, those immersed in white Christian spaces and trying to be a part of racial reconciliation efforts, sensed in a new way that all our efforts to get different hues in the pews might not be fostering the understanding and the change that we had hoped. At that time, many black Christians were looking around at white Christian leaders, wondering if and when they would speak up about Martin's killing or Zimmerman's acquittal. Very little happened. And then they killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Now we hit Ferguson. In the wake of Brown's killing, Christians across the color line weighed in, and they didn't all have the same perspective. For example, an article by Vodi Bakum, a black preacher and theologian, literally crashed the website of
the Gospel Coalition, when he wrote, "Brown reaped what he sowed and was gunned down in the street. A life of thuggery is never your friend. In the end, it will cost you. Sometimes it costs you everything." At that point, he says, we started getting pushback, the African Americans that were trying to work on racial reconciliation. In response to saying Black Lives Matter, white evangelicals started saying all lives matter. When we called them protests, the white evangelicals called them riots. When we insisted that the church move faster and do more to fight against racism, white evangelicals called us divisive. Mike Brown's killing highlighted a specific issue, anti-Black police brutality, and demonstrated how anemic evangelical racial reconciliation ideas and efforts were in the face of systemic racism. So modern evangelical racial reconciliation had flaws in its ideological foundations from the very start. Then he goes back to the start and points out that from the beginning, the Evangelical Racial Reconciliation Project was primarily focused on individual behaviors and individual attitudes and almost completely blind to systems or historic oppression. Sky.
I don't disagree with any of that, but I think whenever you write an article like this, it requires you to simplify the narrative and focus on one stream within the narrative. But I think there are a couple different things going on at the same time. And that's why I brought up Obama's election. And when you look at what was going on in the late 2000s, early teens, you had Obama elected to the White House. You had state after state after state legalizing gay marriage until eventually the Supreme Court legalizes it in 2014. You do have this rise of Black Lives Matter and the concern over systemic racial injustice in our policing and criminal justice system. You have all this stuff going on, and you have a very embittered right-wing media that's convincing a lot of conservative white Americans that they are under siege and that there's this liberal takeover of the country, and a lot of conservative evangelicals feel under siege. And I think the racial reconciliation movement that kind of emerged in the 90s and early 2000s, I think it died because white evangelicals felt like they were under attack, and that their priority had to be self-preservation and the protection of their institutions, and something that they saw as so peripheral or a luxury like racial reconciliation got thrown out the window to batten down the hatches and protect themselves in the siege mentality.
Yeah, but Caitlin, you want to tell him that he's wrong?
No, I do think we often look at dynamics in predominantly white communities and ascribe a diversity of motives when race is a really significant one that isn't explicitly stated, but plays a larger role than maybe we realize. And I think what Sky's described is not just that there's a diversity of things feeding into that, but also that like race plays a factor in all of those things. Like the fears that are cultivated in those communities, even when they are ostensibly not about race, are often very much about race. A lot of the stuff about protecting our children or, the way of life of our communities, we talk about those in the context of other things like sexuality and what's happening politically, but often those are coded in racial kinds of ways. The things that people imagine when they talk about their kids and their communities are often white communities, and the things that they imagine as the scary things that will, come and attack them are often people who do not look like them, particularly people of color. So even though there are all of those other things involved, I think sometimes we, out of a desire either to be generous to other communities or out of a desire for ourselves to say, like, that's not me, can ignore the parts in which that whole vision is so shaped racially.
Right. For me, what I've noticed is that there was the assumption, I believe, on the part of many conservative white Christians that if Black people come to Christ, they will also adopt conservative political values, because we don't see the distinction between the two.
Yeah.
And that was the shocker, I think, on both sides, was white people who now had Black friends in their church because they've been promoting racial reconciliation found out that their Black friends were still Democrats or, voted for Hillary Clinton and who's pro-choice. So the number of people when I put out the race videos, the number of white conservative Christians who attacked me for suggesting that not all Christians voted Republican, and just with complete disbelief, which is why I had to make another video about how white Christians can vote one way and black Christians can vote another way, even though they're reading the same Bible and praying to the same God. So I think there was an assumption of assimilation in the racial reconciliation movement that was never articulated. So it caught both sides by surprise. That, someone like Jamar Tisby, because he says his conclusion was they wanted black faces, but not black voices. You could look like a black person, but you couldn't have the point of view of the majority of the black community. And on the white side, people were saying, wait a minute, how can I be your friend if you vote for a pro-choice candidate? How can I be your friend if you don't believe in small, limited government? I think you're probably a Marxist.
Well,
And that made it impossible to hold those relationships together.
I think you're absolutely right. But the critical thing to understand there, it isn't just that African American Christians who were in predominantly white Christian environments held different views. They were perceived to be holding the views of the greatest threat to Christianity. That's the problem, is when you have a siege mentality and the enemy that's coming against you are Democrats and progressives, and the people that you have been trying to integrate with for the last 20 years hold views or are voicing opinions that seem to conform to the other side of the political aisle. That's not just a political difference. It's viewed as they're the enemy.
Right.
They're the ones who are out to get us. And that's where it becomes incompatible. But it just shows how deeply intertwined a lot of white evangelical Christianity is with white Republican politics. And that's the enemy that needs to be unbundled, not let's stop this racial reconciliation stuff.
But does it go both ways? Does African American Christianity need to be unbundled with Democratic politics?
Yes. All Christianity
We
needs
all
to be
need to
unbundled with
unbundle.
political parties.
And we all vote for the Green Party.
No, but it also means that I can be in community with somebody who votes differently than I do if our primary identity is that of Christian sisters and brothers, and we can
Right.
talk about our different prioritization of issues when we enter the voting booth. But when I write somebody off because of the way they vote, rather than because of their theological allegiance to Christ, something's wrong.
Right.
Can,
Kaylin,
can I go back to the Voti Bakum thing?
Pat Robertson thing?
I know we can leave that. Didn't want to touch that.
Okay.
I made fun of you for tweeting about it, but seriously, I think it's important. And I really want to, I just can't imagine people seeing the firestorm from your tweet or hearing us talk about this. And they can imagine conversations they have had with their family members where their family member says, hey, Candace Owens is not the voice that you should be listening to. And their family member goes, you told me to listen to Black people. Like, this is a Black person I am listening to. I think it's important to talk through like what's going on there, because I think that is what a lot of conversations people are having are. And I think there's a couple important things about that, which is related to this whole conversation about racial reconciliation and what really should be happening in communities, which is one, so much of the time, like a lot of us do this, where we find someone that fits the identity that we think will give us some leverage for whatever position that we're holding. I saw this in churches where, something racist would be done or said, and the person who did or said it would justify it by saying, oh, I have a Black friend. And they said it was fine. They thought it was funny or cool or whatever, so it's fine. Part of that is talking about individual people as if they are a monolith, as if they speak for the entire community that they are coming from, and as if they're not a fully formed human being with complex background and history and opinions, and they're shaped by, it's treating people like a stereotype, which is not helpful. But the true thing that someone is identifying when they say, hey, don't listen to Candace Owens, or maybe Voti Bakum is not the person to lead the SBC's racial reconciliation movement, is something that gets lost in the conversation about you should listen to especially marginalized voices, is we are still looking for truth. We still believe in objective truth about the world and about our own country's history and about how we need to respond to it. We believe that it exists. We just believe that especially white people in America have so benefited from destructive systems that it is hard for us to see the truth. And so we have to listen to a diversity of people. And the reason it's important to say that is to say the reason that I would say to someone, hey, don't listen to Candace Owens as your main source of news on this is not just because Candace Owens is the wrong kind of person for you to listen to if you're listening to Black voices, but because I think she doesn't describe the history of America accurately. I think we've gotten tons of voices that have helped us understand, especially Black activists and historians and sociologists that have described to us as close, we're still finite fallen creatures, but an accurate depiction of our own really broken history and what that demands of us now. And for us to say, oh, I should just listen to Black people, so I found some ones that agree with me, is not only to treat them like tokens and not as fully formed human beings, but it's also to forget like the point of why we're listening to a diversity of people, which is to get at the truth. And so when someone is of an identity that I think it's important to listen to because they've been marginalized, but they're describing the world in a way that really is actually not how it is because of the diversity of voices we've tried to listen to, that's important. That's not actually how America's history was. That's not how things actually are now. I just think that's important to articulate because I think this is a fight that a lot of people have with a lot of their family members and people in their churches. And it basically comes down to like, who do you listen to versus who do I listen to, instead of all of us listening to a diversity of people to try and seek together the actual truth so that we can act well with it.
I just tweeted about something similar to that, Caitlin, today, where I was kind of musing on how do I discern all these crazy arguments that are flying all over the internet all the time. And the first question I have to ask is, does this argument conform to verifiable facts? Like, is it actually reporting accurately what's going on? And that's your point. Like Candace Owens, for example, her view on American history does not conform to the facts.
Yeah.
But then there's a second question. Let's say you can verify, what they're saying is true. That alone doesn't make the argument good because they can be selecting which truths to emphasize and which to leave out. And that leads to the second question, which is, does my agreement with this person's argument ask anything of me? Or does it just reinforce what I already want to believe so that I don't have to change anything?
Hey, that's not fair.
Why?
Because if I'm right, I shouldn't have to change anything.
That's true. That's true. And we'll get to that in a second. But it should be at least a yellow flag, if not a red flag, if that argument requires nothing of me, because it means I might be tricking myself into confirmation bias.
I gotta tell you, Sky, I've been stunned with the popularity of fringe Black voices with conservative white Christians whose messages imply, if there is a problem, it's not my problem.
Right.
We seem to be really, really drawn to feeling like nothing, like you said, like nothing is required of me because it's not my problem, it's their problem. And so, when Vodi Bakum says, which he has said on numerous occasions, the root source of the problems of the African American community, the root source is fatherlessness. Okay, that is why we see all the problems we see in the African American community. For me as a white guy, I say, hooray, I can't solve that, so I don't have to do anything. And especially, you can't convince me that I should vote for any more government help.
And that's a great example. People. So run that through my two questions. Number one, is there a problem with fatherlessness in Black communities in America? I think we would all agree, yes. That's a verifiable fact.
Verifiable fact, there's a problem with fatherlessness in Black American community, and also lower income white American communities.
Okay, sorry. But then the second question is, does my agreement with that idea require anything of me? And you've just given the example, no, it does. As a white person in America, it doesn't require anything of you, which is probably a position a lot of white people in America would like to hold. So at that moment, you have to ask yourself, okay, yellow flag, if this idea doesn't require anything of me, if I like the conclusion and the basic fact of it is true, if I stop right there, that should be a big red flag. Because when something's true and I want it to be true, what it should drive me to ask is, am I getting the whole truth or only a piece of it? And in order to get a wider vision of the whole truth, the first thing I should seek to do is I need to engage voices who are saying something different than Vodi Bakum. And maybe in my exploration of those other voices, I come back to the conclusion that he was right. And I'm going to stick to that thing that I wanted to believe in the beginning because I've checked it against 3 or 4 or 5 other perspectives, and I still think it's true and I'm holding to it. But chances are, if you check that against 3 or 4 or 5 other points of view, you're going to get a much fuller picture of reality that might ask something of you and challenge your simplistic, self-verifying, comforting point of view. And that's what we don't do. The moment we get the answer we want, we just stop right there and go, I got it. I don't need to hear anything else.
Right.
And
right.
that's, yes, fatherlessness is a problem in the Black community and poor white community as well. It's one piece of a much more complicated reality. But we don't want that more complicated reality because that will ask something of
Right.
me.
Yeah, and another question to ask then is, if fatherlessness is a problem, what has led to fatherlessness?
Right.
And do I have any sort of cultural, social responsibility for what led to it?
Yes.
Or can I be
Or-
part of the solution
Exactly.
of undoing what led to it?
Yes.
And we don't want to go there because we just don't want to have to get involved. It's I documented this in one of my race videos, that attitudes towards welfare changed dramatically when Americans started associating welfare with poor Black families instead of poor white families. And it was the news, particularly inner city rioting in the late 1960s, that changed the color of the skin of the people in the pictures in stories about poverty from white to Black. And at that point, America's views of welfare started to degrade rapidly because we weren't that excited about helping them. They need to help themselves. So racism has, impacted how we view helping people, which is kind of astonishingly sad.
Well, and we're seeing it unfold right now in Ukraine. I mean, it is a humanitarian tragedy, but the way Americans are responding to that is very different than the way they responded to the refugee crisis in Syria and the Middle East over the recent years.
Right. So Sky, do you think we need a quote unquote racial reconciliation movement? And how would you even define that? Because I don't really understand that term.
Well, a lot of people pointed out that reconciliation might be the wrong word. What we need is conciliation.
Yeah.
Because it's assuming that there was unity in the
did
past.
we have a fight one day and break up and we need to make up from our fight? I don't think that ever happened. So, and Jamar Tisby's point is, because he also lists in this piece, which we'll put in the show notes so you can read it, he lists then the election of Donald Trump as another kind of brick in the wall of ending the racial reconciliation movement. He quotes sociologist Michael Emerson, who said in a New York Times piece in 2018, the election of Donald Trump was the single most harmful event to the whole movement of reconciliation in at least the past 30 years. It's about to completely break apart. And then he goes on to name the CRT hysteria as the latest blow to the evangelical racial reconciliation movement. Critical race theory has become the latest blow to the movement. The American Bar Association defines critical race theory as a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society. But so far, at least 36 states have adopted or introduced laws or policies to restrict teaching about race and racism in schools. So this manufactured hysteria, he says, over CRT has caused yet another rift in evangelical racial reconciliation endeavors. And it's not, just watching attitudes shift since we started talking about race on the podcast, where it was almost universal. That's really helpful information. Thank you. And then just started to shift more and more to, I think you're woke. I think you're promoting CRT. I think you're a cultural Marxist. It was all these new buzzwords that had been distributed through right-wing media to encourage white people to push back against calls for justice from Black people. And that makes reconciliation difficult. So Jamar Tisby's conclusion is you can't have reconciliation. You can't pursue racial reconciliation without pursuing racial justice. It's an empty form of reconciliation that ends up as, hey, there's a Black person in my church. I think we're reconciled. And that doesn't do it. Caitlin, you got any final thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, on the same note about reconciliation versus justice, is also the way reconciliation, at least in scripture, has both this personal element, right? Reconciliation, us personally with God, and also us personally with other individual persons. But it also has this grand cosmic scheme. And the word justice is often used to describe that also in scripture. Righteousness and justice, interchangeable, like this sense of things as they are intended to be, which can involve both reconciliation from an original state of good relationship, but also for all of us born into a fallen world, there was never an original state for us of anything good. And so that kind of cosmic frame of reconciling all things it seems to me like if that was the way we talked about reconciliation in other contexts, it would be easier to redeem this word in the context of racial reconciliation, because we'd have a sense of, it doesn't always imply a prior state of goodness. It isn't just personal or individual. It is structural and large. But because we kind of have this general theological problem where we've missed that cosmic frame, where we've missed how, salvation happens in all creation and in human relationships and across power dynamics and in communities, like because we have that larger theological problem, that translates into when a church says we're doing racial reconciliation, people bring all of those theological problems with how we think about reconciliation into that conversation and think it's individual and personal. And also, I think Christians, especially evangelical white Christians, we have a real aversion, like for all of the aversion we have to talking about race, we have a real aversion to talking about class and capitalism and the structural problems that have caused really serious racial problems as well, that really come down to like economic financial decisions too. And we have such an aversion to talking about that. It's why you can tag someone Marxist, and that's the live wire you can't touch and the conversation is over. But that's also kept us from talking about like the real economic causes of racial division and racial violence in our country. And that's a whole other, like that's a theological problem and it's a political problem. And until we're willing to have a conversation about those kinds of underlying dynamics, which include poor white people in our country as well, we're not going to get anywhere with race, because we can't even touch that without having a, problem.
Okay. Caitlin, I love you, but I'm going to call bull.
No, not on Caitlin.
Partly because I just wanted to see that face so we can get another gif out of this episode. But here's why. You're right and you're wrong. Everything, your analysis is correct, but I've struggled with this because I thought for a long time the way you did, which is a lot of white evangelicals just don't have a systemic understanding of theology. They don't have a cosmic scope understanding.
We keep having this fight, you and me.
I know. And the
you
more
guys
I get
need
into
to reconcile. I'm going to start a movement of Sky Caitlin reconciliation.
But here's the reason why I can't buy that argument anymore. Is because so much of white evangelical cultural engagement in the world right now is entirely focused on systemic change, right? We've talked about ending abortion. They're not trying to do it just by changing individual hearts. They want to change the law. They want to change state laws and the Supreme Court. Tax policy. If you believe in small government and lower taxation, you're not just telling people out of the goodness of their heart to change. You want to change the system. You want to change the laws and the policy. You go on down the list of, there are how many parents now upset at school board meetings saying we want to change the policies of what gets taught at our schools. We want to change what books are in the library. Those are systemic approaches to what they think is evil in the world. But when it comes to race, suddenly, no. We can't do anything systemic about that. That's just individual hearts. So it isn't that white evangelicals have this individual approach to sin and they lack an ability to think or imagine a systemic solution to problems. It's just that they have selected which issues they believe deserve a systemic approach and which ones don't. And they happen to fall along the lines of the political parties. And if it's something that the left cares about, it's individual sin only. If it's something the right cares about, we need systemic upheaval. So I think we absolutely have systemic categories in white evangelicalism. They just conform to our politics rather than to scripture.
It's interesting. I wonder if any, and I'll let Caitlin take a shot back at you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's interesting. I wonder if any conservative white evangelicals would dispute that Planned Parenthood is a sinful system, not just a couple sinful people,
right?
But it's an entire. The abortion industry is a sinful system. So yeah, we see sinful systems, but only where we want to see them. And I don't think anyone would argue that slavery wasn't a sinful system. We just insist that the sinful systems regarding race ended in 1968, and there aren't any more.
Or in
today.
1868.
1968. The Jim Crow was a sinful system. Caitlin, Caitlin, go. Smack Sky.
No. I think he's right. No, I do think the way that I described the very beginning of that, the theological problem, I do think that's a theological problem. I do think that can be overly simplistic and kind of get us out of too many things. But I have two things to say about that. One is the way you've just described, we would all say slavery and Jim Crow, sinful systems. I think Christians have a special problem because of that earlier theological problem. seeing not just that system as sinful, but that system having effects outside of the legal construction of that system. We have a harder time thinking, I might be socialized as a person in such a way that I gain prejudices or biases, not by virtue of the way a law constrains me to act, but by the way the law created a norm or a system or a set of expectations or a story that I kind of bought myself into. So we're down with legal solutions to things. We think Planned Parenthood is bad, and we should have a structural remedy to that problem. I think it's harder for us to identify, though I think some Christians, if pressed on this, a lot of evangelicals would agree with this. I just don't think this is the way they would think, would say, if I live in a community in which there is a high number of abortions, that changes the culture in significant ways that shapes my community. I think that's true. And I think if described in those kinds of terms, because it's politically acceptable, they would go along with it. But I don't think that's how we tend to think about those things, that they exist not just in the legal structures of things, but that those legal structures have effects beyond that.
Well, hold on, let me go back on that, because I think you're right. But when, again, you bring it into a very right-wing issue, it changes. So since I was a kid, I've been hearing about how sexualized we are as a culture.
That's fair.
Right? It's not that sex is mandated in a legal way by the government. It's that the media and the culture and the music and Hollywood and the internet is all sexualized, and that has a malforming effect on young people. And there are all kinds of conservative religious crusaders out there who want to change the culture. Sometimes they employ laws to do that, but sometimes it's just, we're going to go make Christian movies now instead of Hollywood. So again, it depends on the subject. And if it's one that they've been taught to care about,
yes,
they approach it systematically.
Yeah. And I do think it is important to articulate that it is selective, but I do think it is not the fundamental way we tend to approach political or social problems, which is that outside of legal structures, there is also kind of a life of their own that they kind of take on in forming stories in our cultures. So that's a good example of one that we do. The second thing I was going to say is just not that it's just a question of structural versus individual, but what I was trying to say is also there is such significant implications for a capitalist system that we are so unwilling to touch, because even just saying capitalism, people freak out, and we don't have
you're a Marxist.
And then you're a Marxist. And it's important. It's really, really important. And I'm biased. This is what you're going to get from me from now on. Like, I'm taking a class this semester on Christianity and capitalism. I'm reading all of this stuff about it. But I got to tell you, I have to tell you, I am reading. I am only just now, halfway through the semester, getting into any of the theological positions that anyone in a conservative evangelical church would freak out about, right? The womanist stuff or the liberal stuff, like the stuff they're freaking out. The whole first half of the semester is a bunch of patristic writers, a bunch of Reformation writers going, look at how a system in which we subordinate everything else in our lives to the making of profit destroys human souls and causes us to mistreat each other. We spent half a semester just reading sources that I think anyone in a conservative evangelical church would be forced to say they agree with. And those sources said there is something incredibly destructive, not just about the love of money, but about a human culture and society that is constructed in such a way that it operates with that as the ultimate goal. And it produces really negative things, including the fact that we find justifications for really messed up economic conditions by creating stories about different races that are not biologically rooted in anything. They're not real. They're socially constructed. And we do really horrific things to each other because of both racism and economic exploitation. And if we aren't willing to have that conversation, because that's the live wire we can't touch because you'll get called a Marxist, we're going to continue having communities that are exploited. And we have theological resources from our entire tradition to respond to that we are ignoring because we're too freaked out politically right now.
Amen. Caitlin, I don't know if you had this experience, but in my 3 years in seminary, I don't think I had a single class or lecture or anything on economics or consumerism.
Yep, same.
I mean, it's just the unspoken air you breathe and no one questions it. And yet there is that huge, rich tradition in Christian theology going back to the patristics on all these issues, but we don't go anywhere near them.
Hey. Ever since the Cold War, we learned that only capitalism can save the church. So the church must save capitalism.
And I am pro-capitalism, but what we're not talking about is how does capitalism shape and form us in ways that are contrary to the gospel so that the church can counteract some of that. I'm not in favor of overthrowing capitalism, but I want to help form disciples in a way that makes them faithful to Christ in a capitalist system. But if you never
Jesus
talk about it, forget it.
Jesus produced a whole lot of fish, and he sold them at a fair profit, and he was able to fund his ministry journeys across the Sea of Galilee
I think you should
with
go
his
back to your
fish
Bible.
fish profits. Back to the
Check that one.
Bible.
Check
That
that one
sounds
out.
like
Check that
a
one
great.
out.
What would really mess people up is when they find out it's mostly women who funded his ministry.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's weird, man. How does that work? Okay, we got to wrap it up. Next week is our 500th episode. Did you know, Caitlin? Did you know that?
I did.
Did you know that next week is our 500th episode? It's so exciting. We're doing special things that are taking extra work. Jason and I were just talking about how many available hours do we have in the next week to try to do all the extra special things that we want to do. So you're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be great. We'll have a full 500 voice choir, one voice for every episode. There'll be fireworks. There'll be puppies, free puppies for everyone. It's going to be fantastic. And you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. So come back next week for the fun. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters, you can do some special stuff for the 500th, but the stuff might have ended by now because we needed to collect it all. But thank you.
Yeah, don't do anything special now, guys. It's over.
No, sorry, do nothing special whatsoever. Just sit and wait for the 500th episode. And we will see you next week. Goodbye. The Holy Post podcast is funded by listeners like you who support us on Patreon. This episode is also supported by Abide, the #1 Christian meditation app. Do you get anxious? Have a hard time calming down? It's hard to calm down just by telling yourself to calm down, like telling yourself not to think about elephants. See, you're thinking about elephants. That's why lots of people are turning to meditation apps. But what are you meditating on? Fill your mind with the Bible with the Abide meditation app. Abide users report less stress, lower levels of anxiety and depression, and better sleep. And for a limited time, listeners of the Holy Post will get 25% off a premium subscription when you visit abide.co/holypost. So get started now with 25% off a premium subscription by downloading the Abide app. You'll get additional stories and meditations, premium music, soothing sounds, and more. Support the Holy Post and get 25% off by going to abide.co/holypost. That's abide.co/holypost to download the Abide app and get 25% off your premium subscription. And now, back to the show.
I'm delighted to have David Brooks as my guest today. I've been reading his articles for years and his books, and we've cited him frequently on this podcast. He's been an op-ed columnist for the New York Times for nearly 20 years, and he's often seen on PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He's the author of a number of best-selling books, including Bobo's in Paradise and The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement. He also teaches regularly at Yale University. Last month, he wrote 2 articles for the New York Times that caught my attention, which we discuss in this interview. We will have links to both articles in the show notes. The first is called The Dissenters Trying to Save Evangelicalism from Itself, where he profiles a lot of people we've had on this show who are trying to rescue evangelicalism from its descent into politics and culture wars. And then he also wrote an article called The Dark Century: Why Our Era Has Grown So Ugly, about the optimism of the 1990s and how everything seems to have just fallen apart in this new century. Our conversation is very wide-ranging today, covering things like evangelicalism, the way it's perceived by secularists, the response to the war in Ukraine, and even about what the church needs to do if it's going to take spiritual formation seriously. And the good news is, for you Patreon supporters, we have an extra bonus interview with David Brooks about the future of the Republican Party after Donald Trump. So there's a lot to cover in this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here is David Brooks. David Brooks, welcome to the Holy Post.
Good to be with you, Sky.
I've been reading your stuff for a long time. We met briefly in the fall, and I'm just delighted to finally have you on the show.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. I've heard about the show, I've heard about you, so it's a pleasure to be part of it.
So last month, you wrote a piece that we actually talked about a few episodes ago called The Dissenters Trying to Save Evangelicalism from Itself. And one thing that caught my attention is a lot of the people you featured in that article have been guests on our show, so I felt kind of validated by your selection. But the other thing was we've been presenting those voices to people who are largely inside the evangelical camp or who are dissatisfied within evangelicalism, but you are presenting those voices in the New York Times. And you tend to move in a pretty elite liberal environment between Yale and the New York Times and other places. So let me begin with how did your audience receive that article? And what was their response to hearing those kinds of voices that I'm guessing they don't get a lot of exposure to?
Yeah, there's a positive and a negative way to see it. The positive way to see it is that readers of the Times, were super curious. And so I haven't checked the numbers for a while, but after a few days, I checked to see how many readers there were. And there were over 1 million, I think. And the vast majority of them, or the significant majority, were New York Times readers. It was not people that heard, maybe in the evangelical community, had heard about the article and they had clicked on. These were Times readers. So that suggests to me there's great curiosity. The negative side of the thing is the act of writing the article and placing it in the paper made me realize how vast a gap in knowledge there is between the evangelical or even the broader Christian world and the secular world. That there are some phrases that seem normal to me that were just unfamiliar. It wasn't people were hostile. They just had never heard phrases like Christian formation or evangelical subculture or agape love. These were just unfamiliar concepts. And it reminded me that in 20 or 30 years ago, most people would have had grown up in a church or around a church. They knew church world. And now a lot of people just haven't grown up with any contact at all. And so they don't know the concepts, haven't heard them. And the upside of that is they don't have a lot of baggage about it. Faith is just a different world they don't know anything about. It's not that they grew up and rejected it.
I guess it's kind of you to say that they don't have any baggage about it, but it seems to me that there are a lot of perceptions of evangelicals in the broader society that carry a lot of baggage. Not that it's a personal experience, but just from what they've seen in media and political coverage. So in the circles you tend to move in, what is the perception generally of evangelicals?
Yeah, I'll talk about my personal experience. So I've been teaching at Yale for 20 years. And as you said, Yale's a pretty elite, progressive place. And I would say 20 years ago, it was very uncool to be a Christian at Yale. It was like you had acne. And then about 10 years ago, I'd say it began to seem a little cooler. I remember one class I had when we were teaching the book of Exodus. And one of my students, who was from the Bay Area, said, "Can you believe people used to take this seriously and now we find it so repugnant?" I don't know what she was thinking, because there were a couple of Jewish guys in kippas in the room, and the two smartest, coolest, best-looking students in the class were both Christian. And they said, "Well, actually, we do take this seriously." And those two students took her out to coffee for several weeks just to tell her what it was like to be a person of faith. But I would say for a little while, it seemed to be a slight plus, in my view, at Yale to be a Christian, because there was this time you had spiritual depth. And that all changed in 2015 with Donald Trump. And then being an evangelical, the reputation went through the basement. And it was mostly seen as being Republican, or a Trumpian style of Republican. And so it became seen as more of a political identity. And even I looked at some of the comments to that piece I had in the Times. I quoted, as one would if you were covering the church, I quoted some African-American pastors and church leaders. And a couple of the comments were, he must have found the only two Black guys who are in the church. I felt like saying, have you heard of Martin Luther King? Like, there's a Black church. And so, yeah, I would say now the reputation, you're right, carries a lot of baggage. But I still think among Times readers who took the trouble to read, there's also some curiosity, especially about the diversity of the church, which maybe they know nothing about.
So that speaks to a larger cultural phenomenon, which is we just don't know each other anymore. And the great sort, or however you want to frame it, what are the implications of that nationally? A student in class from the Bay Area has no personal knowledge of somebody of faith, or the only perception we have of people of faith are what we see in social media, perhaps, or some of the really loud, crazy uncles, as we call them on our show. On the flip side, there are people in red America, maybe church-going evangelicals, who know nobody who's a progressive or liberal or secularist or LGBT, or at least they don't think they do. What are the implications of that?
Well, not good. I've come
Well,
to
yeah.
think, and I'm writing a book about this. I've come to think that one of the core problems is we have an epidemic of blindness in society, that rural folks think that urban elites don't know how they live. A lot of black folks think that white people have no clue about their daily experience. Republicans and Democrats look at each other with blind incomprehension. And so people just feel unseen. And, I live on the East Coast, but I travel to 2 or 3 states a week. And when it used to be, I'd go to the Midwest about once every 2 weeks. I'd hear the phrase flyover country. You think we're just flyover country. But recently, in the last couple of years, I hear that like 6 times a day. And that's people saying, you guys don't see us. And it takes social courage to get outside your bubble. But I find it entertaining and fun to get outside my bubble. Maybe that's why I went into journalism. But a lot of people they don't get outside their bubble. And it's not only like a progressive doesn't know what a conservative thinks. They only know what progressives think other conservatives think. And so they're getting this filtered view of reality. And to me, it's just the balkanization of the country and a personal tragedy and a national tragedy.
So Sherry Turkle at MIT has written about this, and early on she thought that technology was going to actually help bring us together because we now have the tools to engage people anywhere, anytime. But in her research, she's found it's the opposite. That the technology has actually driven us further and further apart. So as you look at history, and you've written a lot about these social and political trends, are we in uncharted territory with the technology we're facing right now, or is history repeating itself in some way that should give us hope that this is temporary?
Yeah, I'm well, I have some hope just because my read of history is we go through crises. And there's a historian, Samuel Huntington, really a political scientist, who said every 60 years or so, America goes through a moral convulsion. And it's a time of great anger and division and indignation at established power. A new moral generation comes on the scene. There's new forms of technology. And it happened in the 1770s with the revolution, happened in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson, happened in the 1890s, progressive era, happened in the 1960s. And writing in 1981, he said, I don't know if I believe in 60-year cycles, but if the pattern holds, somewhere around 2020, we'll have another moral convulsion. And so he was right. And does technology completely drive us apart? I lean on it's bad, but it's not that bad school. So
Okay.
it drives people feel constant judgment. And it's caused, I think, contributed to a rise in teenage suicide and depression. But Denmark has a lot of social media, and they have high social trust. They have a healthy society. And so it's not just the technology, because the effects are particularly acute in America.
Is that because
American moral problem as much as a technological problem?
Is part of the difference between a Denmark and an America is just the vast diversity we have in this country, just how different we are in culture, religion, race, that Denmark doesn't have that chasm to overcome?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I celebrate diversity. I love America because we have all kinds here. But I think the evidence is pretty clear. Diversity makes social trust harder. It doesn't make it impossible. You can work if you're in a neighborhood that's diverse or in a church that's diverse. You can work. And I'm not just talking about racial diversity, economic diversity, ideological diversity. But you have to work to overcome it. And there's only one way to do that. It's conversation. You got to sit down and talk to people. And if you don't do that, then you do fall into pseudo civil war.
Okay, so to challenge your optimism a little bit and it's bad, but it's not that bad. You wrote a piece a couple weeks ago called "The Dark Century," which is pretty ominous. So you begin by talking about all the optimism that you felt as a journalist in the 1990s. I was a college student in the 1990s. I kind of resonated with some of what you articulated. A lot of our audience has no memory or living memory, at least, of the 1990s. Explain what the optimism was in that decade.
So I wrote then. I was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and I covered half the world: Europe, Africa, Middle East, and I covered nothing but good news. I covered the end of apartheid and Nelson Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa. I covered the reunification of Germany and the unification of Europe under the EU. I covered the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of what seemed to be a democratic Russia. I covered the independence of Ukraine and what seemed to be the rise of a democratic Ukraine. So it was an era where democracy seemed to have triumphed. capitalism seemed to have triumphed, and walls seemed to be coming down. And that turned out to be not what happened.
Well, here we are watching a war unfold in Europe for the first time
Right.
since the 1940s. I mean, it's shocking.
And I think what we did, we were naive. We thought democracy was natural, like easy. But you got to work at it. And the world peace, we thought, that's natural. We've overcome all those old demons in human nature. Well, you got to work at it. You got to protect against the wolves who are threatening the common order. You have to work at democracy. And even just what we were talking about, to have a democratic system, we have to learn to respect one another, and we have to learn about one another. I found people are super hard to hate up close. And so I'm not a Trump person by any means, but I spend a lot of time with Trump supporters, and I always come away sort of liking them. And my view is that Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. They're asking very legitimate questions about this country. But you got to do that democratic work, and we haven't done the work.
So you cite in there historian Robert Tracy McKenzie, who we actually had on the show just a few weeks ago, and his book, We the Fallen People, where he articulates, and it sounds like you agree with him, that the founders of the United States had a view of humanity that we've lost sight of. Explain that view of humanity that we've lost sight of, and is it possible to get it back, or have we just bought into the progressive liberal fairy tale a little too much to experience it again?
Yeah, I think, those who grew up in the church or any religious tradition, frankly, even the secular tradition before 70 years ago, grew up with an idea of human sinfulness, that we were wonderfully made, but also broken and sinful, that we have, and that we therefore have to struggle to become good people. And we do that through our spiritual disciplines. We do that through acts of Christian formation, or we do that through character building. And throughout American history, starting at the founders, they believed that you couldn't have a good society unless people were willing to build character. That is to say, I wrote a book called Road to Character about people who did this. And they basically, one of the things they did was they looked at their chief sin, was anger, greed, envy, and they worked on it. They tried to diminish the power of their chief sin. Another thing they did is they tried to fall in love with the right things. St. Augustine is right, that you become what you love. And if you love God, you'll become a little more Christ-like. If you love goodness, you'll become a little good. If you love money, you'll become a little greedy. And so it's a question of organizing your loves. And that's what faith hopefully gives us. And that was the prevailing view for centuries. Then round about 1950, we have another view of the human person, which is that people are good inside. And all evil in the world is outside. It's by institutions. And so you don't have to do any character formation because you're naturally good. You just have to be free. And once you start thinking you're good inside, well, you're going to give your selfishness free rein. B, you're going to stop with the act of character formation, which gives you something to do in life. And it gives you a sense of moral meaning. And so when everybody thinks they're good, it doesn't lead to lots of self-esteem. It leads to a lot of fragility because people don't understand why the world is not working, why they are not living up to their expectations. They feel fragile. And as a result, you get rising depression rates, rising suicide rates, rising opiate addiction. And then they do what human beings do when they've got too much freedom. They flee from freedom. And this is what happened in 1930s Germany. They had too much freedom, so they fled into the arms of Adolf Hitler. And now, in my view, people who flee from freedom flee to tribes. And it can be the progressive woke tribe, and it can be the Christian nationalist tribe. But we're in an era where people are fleeing from freedom into tribe.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. I was reading some Arnold Galen, I think is his name, a sociologist, and he talked about how a lack of social cohesion or shared values ends up driving the rise of fundamentalism, because it gives you that sense of security in a society where there is so much freedom and so much decision-making that has to happen all the time. Another conservative writer, Andrew Sullivan, has talked about, and I think he's getting it from someone else, but he's talked about the conservation of religious impulse or religious energy. I forget exactly how he frames it. But the argument is that, and in any society, there's a certain amount of religious energy. And when that energy is not focused in traditional religion, it ends up finding a home elsewhere. And he's argued it's finding its home in politics. And that's not good for society. Progressives might say it's fine for society because religious impulse in religion is bad too. How do you see that playing out right now? You talked about the tribalism, but what's the danger of looking to politics for that sense of religious meaning.
Yeah, but I think the chief danger is that in a good view of the human person, the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. In the political view of the human person, the line between good and evil runs between us and them. And so you declare yourself innocent, and you declare the people who are oppressing you, they're evil. And so you get a view of society that's completely Manichaean. The second problem is if you're looking for politics for your spiritual sustenance, you're asking more of politics than it can deliver. Politics is about deliberating and finding solutions in diverse societies without killing each other. That's what politics is. So it's about compromise, and it's about shades of gray most of the time. And it's about the practical business of passing legislation, like getting a road built or whatever. If you're looking for spiritual meaning from that, well, then you're twisting politics into something it's not. You're twisting it into a cultural crusade and a holy war, which is what it has become. I'm struck by how many people are addicted to politics, but they don't care about legislation. Biden's Build Back Better can pass or fail. They don't care. What they want is the cultural performance.
Yeah, the culture wars. Going back to this view of humanity and the idea that we're inherently good and therefore we don't have to work on reforming ourselves and our characters, and combining that with this view of democracy as something that's just inherent, it's a virtue that you don't have to work at. You just plant the seed and it's going to grow. How has that infected our foreign policy over the last 20 years? And is that part of the reason why Putin is doing what he's doing? I mean, I'm thinking back to the Bush administration, George W. Bush, and this now seemingly naive idea that we're just going to roll into these countries in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and democracy is going to take root, no problem, which hasn't exactly worked out.
Yeah.
The Obama administration and the Arab Spring thinking that this was going to be great, and that hasn't exactly turned out. Now Putin's on the move and taking what had been considered a relatively successful democracy in Eastern Europe and trying to revert it back to a fascist state orbiting Russia. So is that part of the problem here? Is our view of democracy is just so anemic that we've been naive for 20 years?
I think we've been a little naive, and I would include myself in that. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I covered all this good news in democracy coming to Central Europe, coming to Africa, coming a bit to the Middle East. And so when it came time to think about Saddam Hussein, I thought the democratic tide is rolling. Let's push it into the Middle East. And I think I was naive about not realizing what it takes to build a democracy and sort of the historical and civil society you got to have. And then I was naive in our ability to understand a foreign culture in a complex situation. And so my support of the Iraq War was a bit of naivete. The reverse, then we've overreacted to that, in my view, and thinking if we couldn't do things right in Iraq and Afghanistan, then we can do nothing right, and that we can withdraw. And that's naive about how dangerous the world gets in a hurry if people aren't out there drawing lines and establishing the norms. And so I think a lot of people were naive about Putin, as we tend to be naive about autocratic dictators. We think they're kind of like us. They'll make rational calculations. They won't do anything crazy. But how many times do we have to learn the lesson that narcissistic, isolated, authoritarian dictators often do things that are really risky and really crazy and really evil? And now we're in the middle of it.
So I know this is an impossible question, but you keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in Washington and certainly the Pentagon and what's going on with Ukraine right now. Is there any, I mean, there's no good outcome at this point because thousands of people have died and at least 1 million refugees out of that country and all kinds of destruction. Do you see a road in which this doesn't just get worse and worse?
I guess I do. And you're pointing out I'm bipolar. I flip between insane pessimism to ridiculously irrational optimism. But I think this week has been at one time shocking and horrifying and scary. We don't know. There are a lot of nuclear weapons in the world. But it's also been a week of awakening.
Right.
Europe saying, oh, this is on our border. Americans saying, oh, we actually do believe in democratic liberalism. We so admire people are willing to fight for their country. And so I'm not sure we have new ideas, but, we've more convicted. And this is something, it's like faith. You can have experiences that make your faith more convicted. It's not like it's different. It's just stronger all of a sudden. And I'd say seeing the Ukrainian lady passing out seeds to Russian soldiers, seeing Zelensky saying, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. That to me is convicting. And I think a lot of people have felt convicted about the things we believe in, which is democratic liberalism. And we've more or less been together. Like I wake up, I turn on my phone, and I see Sweden has sent Stinger missiles. I say, good for Sweden. I see Germany.
Who knew they had them?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I see Germany, upping their defense budget. I see good for Germany. And I look at Japan and I say good for Japan. So all around the world, I felt a unity, not all around the world, but large parts of the world. I felt a unity that I haven't felt in a long time, that we're in a part of a democratic community that can work together.
Well, I feel like we're in a bit of a yin and yang situation here, David, because you're in this bright white room and I'm in this dark room that Phil refers to as the Death Star. You're wearing a pink shirt and a bright blue sweater. I'm in black. Like we just have to play opposites here. So to counterbalance your optimism, and I agree with you, like those have been really encouraging signs for sure. One of the things I worry about, however, is will people on the American right actually take the wrong lesson from what's happening in Ukraine, in that you see this courageous resistance of Ukrainians against this invasion from Russia. And I could see some people on the right going, yeah, that's exactly what we need to do. But the enemy we're fighting are the liberals and the progressives and the Democrats. And they represent Putin. And we're the Ukrainians who will take up arms, will raid the Capitol, will do whatever is necessary to protect our democracy. Is that a possible vision that people could take from this, or am I completely crazy?
Well, I think it's a possible vision, but I think it's a wrong vision.
Of course it's wrong. Yeah.
I'd say a couple things. One, I was afraid conservatives might go a little pro-Putin. He's the guy of wokeism. But if you look at the polls, that's not happening. Republicans and Democrats are pretty equal in being vociferously anti-Putin. And they're completely equal in thinking our behavior toward Putin is not too soft. It's too soft. It's not too rough.
Right.
So there's really not that much partisan difference so far on this. As for whether we think we're Ukraine and we're against the progressives, you mentioned before, and this is something there are a lot of things I'm not an expert in, but there's one thing I'm an expert in. I work at the New York Times. I teach at Yale. I work at the Atlantic. I live in D.C. and New York. I'm an expert in progressive world. I'm more conservative than a lot of people around me, but I know the world. And my read of the world, which I share with conservatives, is that there's like 20% who you would call illiberal and woke and do not tolerate dissent. There's the vast majority, they may be progressive, but they're normal liberal Democrats who want to hear diverse points of view. And they would love to hear from conservative Christians. They would love to have conversations with different sorts of people. And so they're Democrats, like most conservatives. And so to think that there's this phalanx of leftism that is out to get us, which is what I hear from my conservative friends all the time, is a vast oversimplification. And we shouldn't give up on our system that much. And, I was at this thing called the National Conservatism Conference, and it was sort of pro-Trump intellectuals. And it was led by people who think, liberalism is passé. We've got to get rid of it. And we've got to unite the church and the state. We have to use state power to advance the cause of the church. And I feel like saying, you think we're going to have an authoritarian regime and it's going to be run out of the Notre Dame faculty club? No, it's going to get taken over by hoodlums and thugs like Vladimir Putin. If you want to look at your post-liberal world, we'll go to Moscow. That's what it looks like. And I hope that's the lesson we take.
I do too. But unfortunately, we are hearing some voices on the right. I'm thinking of Eric Metaxas, for example, who made a statement about how Putin's not really the enemy we should be fearing. It's Trudeau in Canada and, his vax mandates and the truckers and all that. So it's amazing how quickly we can spin this unfolding tragedy in Eastern Europe into a way of reinforcing our biases here at home. To come all the way back around to the article you did about the evangelical dissenters, as you research that, as you talk to all those different folks, what do you think they're trying to save evangelicalism from? Have you been able to identify the core cancer that is eating away at what had been, at least to some people's point of view, a relatively healthy spiritual community in the United States?
Yeah. If I had to reduce it to a word, I would say politics.
Hmm.
That the church has been subsumed by politics. And I had a line in there that a lot of pastors that I spoke to said, I can't, in my 1 hour or 2 hours on Sunday morning, I can't compete with 40 hours of Fox News every week.
Right.
The problem there is not only that Fox is so bright, but Christian formation is dim. And so the people are looking for a faith. And if the faith can't provide the faith, then they're going to go to politics, as we've been talking about. And so I'd say that the folks I was speaking to are really trying to carve out a faith that's a spiritual thing and not a political thing. And
But if it's not just a messaging thing, though, it sounds like you're identifying a structural problem. The idea of showing up at a church on a Sunday morning and hearing a pastor give a very faithful message for 30 minutes and maybe doing that 2 or 3 times a month, it's never going to stand up to 40 hours of Fox News a week. So do we have a structural systemic thing that we need to rethink and not just a message?
yeah, I do. I think, and at the end, I had a whole series of proposals by Tim Keller on what should be done. And some of it is Christian education. So not just what's happening in the sermon, but a whole process of Christian education. Some of it is enlarging the Christian presence in American universities. And so he had a whole series of things that need to be done. Some of it is reviving a youth pastoring. The decades ago that they formed Young Life, they formed InterVarsity, they created these institutions where people came to faith while in high school or college. And now those institutions are still there and they're still fine, but there need to be more of them. And so a lot of what Tim is suggesting is building institutions that'll pervade life, that will be on-ramps and enriching for Christian formation.
So the added challenge to that is we live at a time when institutions across the board are losing their appeal. And I'm a Gen Xer, but even those younger than me, there doesn't seem to be a ton of impulse to build institutions. Everyone wants to tear them down. Everyone wants to run away from them. But how do we begin to cultivate a society that wants to build, or even a church that wants to build new institutions?
Yeah, I have a friend named Yuval Levin, who's, I think, the most brilliant political analyst in the country. And he says, you're not going to trust an institution unless it forms you into a person with integrity. And so if you join the Marine Corps, it has a method for trying to create young men and women of integrity. And when I meet Marines, and we don't call them former Marines, they're just Marines who are no longer in the service, they love the Marine Corps. And they say that was one of the highlights of my life. Not always pleasant, but it made me who I am. And so if you're an institution that really forms people, then I think you're going to get respected. I meet a Morehouse man, a guy who went to Morehouse College. And I know he's a Morehouse man within an hour because he'll mention it. And I went to the University of Chicago, and I'm not sure I had the most fun in the world, but it formed me in ways that matter to me now more than the day I graduated. And so if our institutions are not shy about trying to form the people within them to be a certain sort of excellent person, and I could be talking about a church, I could be talking about a company, a sports team, then I think they'll be respected. But if institutions don't try to do that, then they will be disrespected, and people will feel unseen within them and unserved.
So yeah, the first book I ever wrote was about the impact of consumerism on American Christianity. And it certainly feels to me like a lot of churches have given up on this mission of formation, and they really have a shadow mission of just winning customers and growing their ranks. And then you set the bar so low, you wonder why no one sticks around. So do we have to kind of reap the bitter harvest of what we've done over the last couple generations in the American church before maybe there's a critical mass of church leaders that step up and go, like Tim Keller, we need to raise the bar here and do a much better job?
Yeah, I would completely agree. One, you've got the people who don't want to ask anything hard of their parishioners because, as you say, the consumers will go where it's easy. And two, you've seen the rise, and I think this is what we talked about earlier, the shift in views of human nature, the rise of the prosperity gospel. And, and my colleague Ross Douthat wrote a book called Bad Religion, which is essentially what happens to the church when it decides that God is inside you. God is the self, and you become self-worshiping. And to me, those are some of the things that have happened.
So how do you link that then to the attraction for a lot of American Christians or I should say American evangelicals, to the strongman, to Donald Trump, to even in some cases Vladimir Putin. Is there a link between those two things? Because I would feel instinctually, if God is within me, if it's about the self, it's about my aggrandizement and sort of the consumeristic ethic, I wouldn't think that would automatically lead one to embrace a Donald Trump or a Vladimir Putin or the strongman kind of thing. How do you see that connection?
Yeah, well, like you said, the pattern is I feel good about myself. The big me, I'm me, I'm me. But then it turns out I feel anxious. I still feel anxious. I feel more insecure. I don't live up to my standards. People don't recognize me. And now I feel scared and I feel there's chaos all around. So I need the strong man to save me. And so I sign up for the strong man. And the strong man he becomes part of me. I can worship, frankly, Donald Trump, and suddenly his strength is my strength. And that's how authoritarian personalities rule. And then I do think there is a siege mentality in the church of feeling under cultural threat. And I think that siege mentality is 50% earned. There is some real hostile forces to traditional faith in this society. I wouldn't want to minimize that. But I think you only make the situation worse when, out of a sense of siege mentality, you decide we're going to throw away, frankly, the Beatitudes, and we're going to go to war. And then you've undercut your own legitimacy. And I think that's a lot of what's happened.
Well, David, I could talk to you all day because you've written about so many different issues, and they always trigger all kinds of questions and thoughts for me. But I appreciate the wide spectrum of conversation we've already had, and I look forward to having you back on again in the future.
Okay, well, thanks. It's been a pleasure to be with you and to see you again.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.